Spot the difference. There are two major changes in the car since you saw it last, and we'll get to that. But first I want to say I've managed to sit down with a windscreen fitting expert, and we had a chat about how this was done, and it's really interesting how he did this. So this episode marks the return of interviews to the series, but it won't be like before because I know it's not everybody's bag. So what I've done is created a condensed version of this interview, and this is how it will be. That will be in the episode, and then the wider uncut versions of the interviews will be available to patrons and supporters on the platforms that I use. And to speak about that for a second, I haven't created a tier system like you would see in a lot of other places. There is no kind of paywall, a certain amount that you pay or have to pay to get a certain amount of privilege. You can come in at the minimum amount that the two platforms that I use allow, which is essentially $1, and you will have the same welcome and the same privilege as somebody who decides that they want to come and approach the series supporting at a far greater amount. It's completely at your discretion. I do behind the scenes videos as often as I can for patrons, and now I'm going to also bring these interviews. And that gives everybody the option, I think. So, I want to say a massive thank you to my new patrons, Alex Dawson, Ben Sands, Brian Watson, David Stafford, Darlin Forrest, Robert Penn, Simon Teven and Simon Woodside, and a special shout to patrons Michael and Davey, who really went out of their way to help me with this whole windscreen situation. I hope you enjoyed this episode. There is another major milestone in the build of this car in this episode, so it has been a very special one for me, and here it is. It was a morning like any other, but I'd had a steer from a fellow Land Rover enthusiast about a company of good guys who do windscreens. And almost no sooner than I'd had the covers taken off the car than a chap called Anthony arrived, and he got straight in to cleaning and inspecting the second-hand heated windscreen that I'd gotten for the car. How he approached this straight away gave me a hell of a lot of confidence. Anthony noticed little pockmarks in the screen that I never would have paid any heed to, and he was able to tell me pretty much how each of them had been made. And by the way, while he worked, the brand new rubber for the screen he'd brought with him was sitting in a bucket of hot water. As it turned out, the windscreen was not without its faults, but the only ones of real concern were these chips along the top edge, where somebody had tried to prise the screen out with a screwdriver. And these chips are vital, because if this thing does crack when we try and put it in, these are where the cracks will start from. Anyway, I had a good chuckle at Anthony when he put this bonnet cover over the car, but how could he know we're not precious about how this thing looks? Anyway, I shouldn't laugh. This is the kind of service that we all hope we're always going to get. So with everything prepped, I gave him a hand pulling the old piece of glass out, and we both got to work peeling off the rubber that I had essentially glued on with butyl tape. But he wasn't disparaging about the fact that I'd used it. It was definitely the first thing I did that didn't help my cause. This tape was gripping the rubber, it was taking up valuable space, and it meant that there was very little movement in anything when I did try and offer up the screen. Now, as it went, it did take little bits of the fresh paint with it. But Anthony had this primer, this specialized primer with him, black primer, and he touched in all of the little places where we'd chipped the paint, or I had chipped the paint, trying to put the screen in. I think my buddy had been wearing his wedding ring, and some of these marks you see at the top of the frame are probably where that was digging into the soft paint. And I now realise I never thought to ask Anthony what this primer was. What I can say is it was quite thick and it dried very quickly. The next thing Anthony did was offer a small amount of this very specialist windscreen sealant. It's a bedding compound and sealant called Arbomast, and he offered it to a few places on the frame itself, but crucially he filled the channel in the rubber the whole way round with this stuff. So with the rubber prepped, it was a very simple matter of offering it onto the frame of the car. Now this Arbomast, it doesn't harden, it stays pliable for seemingly decades, at least 10 years anyway, which means it's supple as you put it in, it will move, and it will allow for the windscreen when that's offered up into the rubber. And look at this conscientious work. He's padding out his tape so that it's not touching our fresh paint, so there's no danger of it pulling paint off with it. Okay, a quick but liberal application of silicone spray, and this is just off the shelf silicone lubricant, and then we grab the screen. And here is something that I'd never seen anywhere in terms of windscreen fitting techniques. My end goes in first, and it's offered right down into the corner, and then Anthony tilts the screen up and offers his corner in from the first place along the A-pillar that it will meet the rubber, and gently slides it down, so we straight away have bedded the bottom end of the screen. There's no stringing, there's no poking with a tool. The bottom end is now not fully home, but it's sitting inside the rubber. And by the way, in the interview, Anthony explains there are different types of rubber, and this particular type of system is what he would call a poke-in system. You do not use a string for this. The shape of the rubber won't allow it. Now he hits the screen with some soapy water, as you might expect, and some more silicone, and goes about starting to gently tease the rubber up around the sides of the glass with a plastic tool. Now here's the second major mistake I made. I was trying to get this rubber to come up and around over the glass, whereas Anthony is just teasing the rubber up so that it is only touching the edges of the glass. It's not over it, but it's not behind it either. The very last thing he will do is bed this whole piece of glass in at once. It's just a case of teasing the rubber up so it's not behind the glass. I only just caught this, but he did use a hook and pick as well. By the way, he did say that the fact that I had split the brand new rubber in the corner when I tried this wasn't a major concern. It could have been sealed. So with the corners of the rubber literally just barely up against the sides of the glass, he then very unceremoniously and very easily slipped the glass back in and used this leather sandbag to literally hit it into place. I was behind the camera trying not to have a nervous breakdown. In fact, I was so caught up in the whole thing, I didn't notice that he had seated the screen. He had moved on to this stage here where he's now applying the Arbomast inside between the screen and the rubber, and he explained very emphatically that that's where you want it. It's not just putting it between the rubber and the glass, it's putting it right deep into the sidewall of the glass so it sits there between the glass and the rubber. And he went round the whole rubber like this. So now the screen is sealed between the glass and the rubber, and between the rubber and the metal frame of the car. If this thing leaks, it would mean there's something seriously wrong. And isn't it simple when you know how? So the last thing he did was to offer in this finishing trim strip. This just locks the rubber in place and makes sure the glass isn't going to pop back out. And I gotta tell you, this kind of mixture of silicone spray and soapy water makes for a very slippery surface. He's making this look very easy, but I dare say it was quite easy. I mean, you can see he's making sure the trim strip is meeting the tool without twists in it, but otherwise this looked very handy. Now the thing that really impressed me was when he cut the end of this trim strip, the join was imperceivable. And I think the trick here is to actually cut it just slightly longer than it needs to be and then force it backward so that the two ends are pressing against each other. And with that, as if to say you better have gotten it right, it started raining. And another reason I am so happy that Anthony is Anthony is that it didn't faze him one bit. We just threw the roof on the car and he kept working. Now there wasn't much left to do. All he was doing here is, now that the screen is fully bedded and the trim strip has meant some of the arbomast has been squeezed out, he's just doing a conscientious job of cleaning away any excess sealant and making sure the job is a good one. Now we know that the join between the roof and the top windscreen frame is so tight that I couldn't even see that it was rusted out. So Anthony, by every right, didn't need to go back and clean away the sealant from the top of the rubber, but he insisted on it. And you could be cynical and say, well, that's because he's been filmed doing it, but I think he's genuinely a very conscientious guy, and I was very pleased to hear him say, let's take the roof off, so he could finish cleaning up the top section of rubber. This is a second-hand piece of glass. It's actually made by Pilkington, which means it's a very high quality second-hand piece of glass. But I gotta tell you, seeing it in and seeing the job that Anthony did, it was such a good feeling. It just felt like the most pristine thing I had ever seen. And with that, the job was done. And we had a good old chat, and I asked Anthony would he come back and let me quiz him on the whole process. And I wasn't sure I was going to hear from him again, but he did. He arrived back a few days later and we had a good old chat. Here's some of the highlights.
My name's Anthony and I've been fitting windscreens for a little over 15 years.
15 years?
15 years, yeah.
And
over 15 years now.
How'd you get into it in the first place?
Oh, I needed a job. I was fresh out of school and I guess it was just handy. Auto glasses on the top of my housing estate, and you know, that's just how I got in.
Did you, when you started, I mean, you must enjoy it though. You must have enjoyed it to keep it.
Of course I did, yeah. I've always enjoyed working on cars, and you know, I like being out and about, meeting interesting people. So, you know, it's always been a job that's attracted me. Is
there an element of control freak about it, or kind of adrenaline or something that, I mean, because you could break a windscreen in most jobs, could you?
I guess it's just like working with eggs. You're going to break a few, but not at all. Like, you know, it's just like any job. I guess you just take your time and just get it done right.
And do you break them? I mean, it happens.
Of course it happens, yeah. Of course it happens. You know, rarely, but it does happen. Most modern cars these days, you know, the windscreens are fairly easy enough to fit, and lucky enough they're not all like that one there, you know. So, yeah, they can be a lot easier these days.
Because you were worried a bit about those chips in my one.
Yeah.
And because that's there where a crack would start. I mean, that's right where the pressure was going to be, right?
Exactly, yeah. Well, there's always going to be a place of stress on the windscreen, the side of the windscreen, and anyway, especially when it's got small little fractures. It's the last thing you want on a window that's already tight enough to go in, you know. So that's the last thing that I wanted to see when I cleaned down the window.
And if the way we did it, was that the kind of method? I mean, do you start really at the bottom? Is that with most windscreens, that type of windscreen, you start at the bottom and you work up?
Yeah, especially with the likes of a H-rubber fitting type of windscreen, yeah, you try slide as much in at the bottom as possible, because you're not putting the stress on, you're not trying to poke it in. So if you can slide it in there nice and easily, naturally, it's a lot easier, and then lay it across the top and then just poke the rest of the rubber out on top of the window, then yeah, it's going to cause it as little stress as possible.
But the pressure will then be, the build-up of pressure is going to then be at the top though, right?
It's always going to be in the centre then, because you're always going to aim to get those two corners in. So once you can get those two corners in, that's that's, as you're probably seeing there, like I didn't push the windscreen all the way home. I just literally put a small bit of rubber over the top of the window on both sides, gave it a small pad in, and before I sent it all the way home, I had to make sure that the middle part of the rubber across the top was done also.
So just that there was no rubber behind the screen, but not necessarily all the way over.
Exactly, yeah, to cause as little stress on it as possible, you know, especially with the likes of those 3 fractures that we had across the top already. Yeah.
So then will you explain to me then, there's different types of rubbers, and then there's different types of techniques for dealing with those rubbers?
Yeah, mainly you're going to have 2 types of rubbers for that type of windscreen. And anyway, you've got an S rubber and a H rubber. And the H rubber is what's on your own Jeep there. The H rubber would be basically in the shape of a H. In between the legs on the bottom, you'd have the aperture of the car, and in between the legs on the top, you're going to have the windscreen. And then obviously then you'll have that small insert that you see me putting in then as well. That's just to lock it all in place. Most of the time with a H rubber, they will be put in with a cold knife or a plastic knife, and you'll just poke them all the way in, as you see in there. With the likes of an S rubber, on the S rubber you're going to have 2 cavities either side. You'll have one where the windscreen goes and the other part where the aperture on the car goes, and most of the time you'll see them being put in with a string. And basically you just put the string along the rubber, and as you offer the rubber and the window up to the car and pull the string, it just replaces the string with the aperture of the car, and that's all.
Okay, back on the car, and for Mojo, I wanted to start doing the things that I needed to do to make the car drivable. Even though there was a lot more work to do elsewhere, I just wanted to be able to try and start it and give it a drive. So I went for the brakes, and I've bought this vacuum testing pump. And the reason I went with this type of brake bleeding tool is because there's also a W123 Mercedes in the background that my sister drives. It has developed central locking problems, and this tool is the way you go about diagnosing those. And it's kind of like a pressure bleeder in reverse. You apply pressure as vacuum at the caliper end of the system, and the theory is you draw the air bubbles through with suction rather than with forced pressure. Now, the big mistake I'd made was I hadn't accounted for ABS, and this car is running a Wabco ABS system, and it's the reason why I had absolutely no joy with this system, and it took me a while to admit defeat and going inside and reading up on this whole process. A pressure bleeding system is what is prescribed for bleeding this particular setup on a classic Range Rover. But something else I read was that the ABS pump itself, all being equal, should pump any trapped air out through whichever bleed nipple you open once the pump is running. So I gave that a go, and sure enough, I was bleeding the rear calipers in seconds. And the way you do this is literally have your bleed tube connected to your bleed nipple on whichever caliper that you're going to do first, depending on the systems in your car. Have the spanner at the ready, turn the ignition on. If the pump doesn't already start, or start when you open the bleed nipple, then give the brake pedal a couple of squeezes, which will start the pump and then run round to release the bleed nipple. Of course, as soon as you see the air bubbles stop, close the nipple and the pump should stop very shortly thereafter, which it did on both rear calipers on the car. Big thank you to Mr. Spider for looking after the dust cover in the meantime while I was working. Okay, to the front calipers. Now there are 2 circuits here for redundancy. There is the circuit we've already bled essentially that runs to the rear of the car, and then there's a separate circuit that runs only to the front calipers. Now we know the rear one's okay, I've just bled it, and that was fine. But I could not get fluid to come through the front circuit of this car. The ABS pump wasn't cutting the mustard, the vacuum pump wasn't cutting the mustard, and I followed all of the procedures, so I'm going to need the pressure bleed system. I moved on. At least we got things cleaned up here, and we'll be ready. Now the weird thing is, the brakes are rock solid, and this thing stops on a dime. But like I say, we'll attack the rest of the bleeding in our final prep for the roadworthiness test. So with the brakes 3/4 done, we move on to the engine bay. Now I had stripped off the top end of the engine, and I mean the induction, the plenum chamber, the mass airflow sensor, the air filter housing, and all associated brackets. I did this over 3 years ago at the start of this whole process. I was just looking for something to do, and at the time I cut a few new homemade gaskets, and I did it kind of behind the scenes. I didn't shoot any of it in stop motion or any motion. I just took a couple of reference photographs of before and after of this plenum. So with a bead of sealant, all of this was ready to go back on. Except for the airbox. And if you think I'd found all of the places where the rust had attacked this car, well, you're wrong. Have you ever seen a rusty box? What does that mean? I had sourced a replacement and everything was groovy until I realised the replacement is from an earlier non-injected car, a carburetted car, and as such doesn't have the same back end on it that incorporates a bracket for the mass airflow sensor. So what we've got to do is release that off the back of the original one. Release the corresponding end off the back of the new good airbox and put them together to create Frankenstein's monster. That's what I did. And here's the thing. With that done, I was able to mount the mass airflow sensor, and I couldn't resist trying to start the car there and then, even though this job isn't finished. I'd be lying if I said this was the first start. That's something that happened in a patron video. There was still fuel in the injector rails and the car started then. Man, it was an amazing moment. I stopped it straight away because I hadn't primed the oil pump. And look, there's a lot of other work that I've already done, like re-trimming and servicing the sunroof, but for now I just wanted to put it on the car and hey, put the front seats in, because this might be a test drive before time, but we're not animals. And I couldn't get fuel into this car quick enough. So here it is. Like I say, not technically the very first startup, but the first startup and run for any length of time. I got caught completely off guard. 3 years of hard graft meant I was blinkered, I was focused, and I find myself all of a sudden driving a Range Rover Vogue SE, my Range Rover Vogue SE, and the first car that I will have the opportunity to put on the road for the first time in over 3 years. So the next thing to do is to book a test. And when I see you next, there will be a result. But before then, you've seen there are some things I gotta get through. The wheels need to be painted, so do the bumpers. There's no back seats yet, and the sunroof, well, that's going to be an issue, but not today. V8, baby!